would you say are the important considerations that leaders must make when making, must consider when making decisions insofar as gender and sexual and reproductive health rights are involved? Maybe you want to speak to us about how these affect decision-making, what is so pivotal about women's sexual and reproductive health rights, and why knowledge around the dynamics of gender and sexual health and sexual and reproductive health rights are important and necessary for a leader to have.
Thank you very much, Audrey, and thank you to AWLF for this opportunity. Deeply honored to be in such great company with feminists that I draw a lot of inspiration from. So when it comes to sexual reproductive health and rights, I think the first thing I want to remind us of is the fact that they are fundamental human rights. And this is really the departure point from which I will be making my submission. So they're fundamental human rights, but are they recognized as such? Are policies and actions in our different countries reflective of this fact? So in 1994, I guess, is when there was a first promulgation of universal access to SRHR, and this was at the International Conference on Population and Development, following which there was a very important definition of SRHR, which included wellness that had to do with both physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being, away from the general understanding of health as, you know, the absence of disease or the absence of infirmities. And so we cannot really talk about attaining sexual reproductive health, universal sexual reproductive health, without talking about attaining or respecting people's sexual and reproductive rights. And so that's a very important departure point that we need to look at. When it comes to sexual reproductive health and rights and gender, you can't really separate the two, because when sexual reproductive health and rights are realized, then we can see a significant impact on the lives of women and girls and gender non-conforming persons. But in the same vein, the push for sexual reproductive health and rights is very much threatened by, you know, the gender discrimination that we see, the gendered violence that we see pushed by the state, but also by our own communities. So the gender power dynamics and the norms that exist in our communities influence what decisions are taken as far as SRHR. And obviously we're talking about the most vulnerable groups in this case, or the most vulnerable communities. And we're thinking women, we're thinking girls, we're thinking LGBTQ plus persons, we're thinking persons with disabilities, we're thinking impoverished communities. So the power dynamics that exist in our communities influence what decisions are taken as far as the sexual reproductive health and rights of different persons. And the issues are also very much interrelated. So we're thinking maternal health, which also includes the very high rates of maternal mortality in our communities. We're thinking abortion, so access to abortion, access to contraceptives. We're thinking the issue of gender-based violence, the stigma and discrimination that people face in their communities. So there is that very strong interconnection. You can't really talk SRHR without looking at the gender dynamics in a specific community or just in general, because I think to a certain extent, there's some uniformity with regards what happens in our different countries, even though we have those borders that separate us. And yes, it has been recognized as a universal right, but then our leaders are not really doing what they ought to do to ensure that everybody has full access to their sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I call this the patriarchy at work, the limitations that we are seeing. A lot of us may be familiar with something like the global gag rule. We have very restrictive policies and laws. In the Gambia, for example, when we talk about abortion, it's not even something that people want to discuss, because in the law, we have one of the most restrictive laws when it comes to abortion, and it is only permissible or legal in a situation where the pregnant woman's life is in danger or is at risk of being in danger if she carries the pregnancy to term, or the second option is if the fetus is at risk of, you know, having health complications, or the life is at risk if the pregnancy is carried to term. So these are the only two conditions under which abortion, for example, can be procured in the Gambia legally. Of course, the other thing is with regards insufficient funding for sexual reproductive health and rights. So not just the programs that run it, but also the provision of the services and the products to ensure that people are able to fully enjoy these rights. And even where the funding exists, what we are seeing, especially in recent years, is significant cuts to this funding, driven mostly by, you know, patriarchal reasoning, driven mostly by moralist excuses that are ensuring that women, girls, non-binary persons do not have access to the sexual reproductive health services that they need. Obviously, this has an impact on who has access, who can afford products and services based on where they are, based on what class they belong to, based on their ability. Obviously, there's also the issue of harmful traditional practices and how they are also connected to issues around sexual reproductive rights. So for example, if we look at the issue of child marriages and how that impacts, so if a girl is pulled out of school, for example, or a girl is never even sent to school in the first place, she gets married up really early, has to deal with the reproductive health complications, but also having to deal with the fact that, you know, there's no opportunity for education. And so there's very little opportunity for growth. There's little opportunity for development. And can we even talk about aspirations for leadership in that context? There's the general systemic discrimination and violence that happens against women. And this is really the driving force. This is why it is important, I think, the question that you asked around why it is important for leaders to have this understanding. The systemic discrimination is what fuels this. It's not about individuals doing one thing or another. It is part of a system. And unless we interrogate that system, unless we, you know, deconstruct that system, disrupt it and bring it down completely, we're not going to see a lot of changes. There's also very heavy restrictions on what sexuality education looks like. So we talk comprehensive sexuality education. In Gambia, for example, they don't even want to use the term comprehensive sexuality education. The government opts for comprehensive health education or some, you know, easy, acceptable term. So even with regards to the name, it's a problem. Talk less of the content of the curriculum that, you know, we share with children under the guise of, oh, we're providing the sexuality education that they need. And so for leaders making decisions around SRHR, so many things to consider. The first one being that every human being has a right to decide what they do with their bodies. And it is not the responsibility of any leader or any person, no matter who they are to you, to decide for you what happens with your body. And also understand that when we make these decisions on gender and SRHR, it is always best to use a human rights perspective, because then it reminds us of, you know, universality, everybody. You cannot divide the law, the rights. People are entitled to their rights. These are rights that they're born with, and that's why they're human rights. And so when we look at decision making around gender and SRHR from a human rights perspective, there is a limited possibility for us to miss it. And so we would not create a space where social and cultural values are now the factor, you know, for which certain laws and policies are brought into place when it comes to SRHR. And also just understanding that women's bodies are not incubators for patriarchal morality. That is something that leaders need to understand. And in the formulation of policies, in formulation of programs, it is the interest of the very people who hold these rights that should be placed at the fore. They also need to think about, you know, certain principles when it comes to the provision of SRHR relating to availability. So what services and products are available? Where are they available? Are they accessible as well? So the position of accessibility, who has access? Is it because they're rich? Is it because they're poor? Is it because they're seen a certain way? What stereotypes are feeding into who has access to the sexual reproductive health services and products that are available, but also acceptability within the communities that we're in, within the settings that we're in. You know, are these materials acceptable? Do they work within our context? Or are we just taking something from one place and bringing onto ours? But also quality, because we can talk about universal access all we want, but if the quality of services and products, you know, are not optimal, then we could be facing a lot more problems. So what we need to promote is sexual health in addition to reproductive health. So when we talk SRHR, usually the focus is very much on reproductive health. And we know why this is. It's because women are seen as reproductive beings. It's because sex is seen as you know, something we do for procreation. So procreation is the only goal for sex under the patriarchy. And so a lot of attention is not given to the sexual health of women. So when we have leaders who understand all of this, they understand the power dynamics and the vulnerabilities in relation to sexual and reproductive health and rights, when they understand the linkages between these rights and all other rights, including the right to education, the right to privacy, the right to health, and all of the rights that we own, then we can begin to see them take steps to perhaps integrate SRHR into broader gender equality and gender equity programs, as opposed to having it as this standalone something that we sometimes touch and sometimes do not touch. And of course, one of the things is always thinking, how do we ensure that the processes are participatory and the people for whom the services and the products that we are bringing forward in a bid to respect their rights, they are also being engaged, they're also being involved in the processes that lead to the provision of these rights. And obviously the last point, more investment in SRHR, more investment in education that allows people to make informed choices, that allow people to make informed decisions when it comes to their bodies. Thank you.